In the shadow of skyscrapers that gleamed with American promise, in the cramped tenements and bustling streets of Harlem, there lived a man whose name became synonymous with power, corruption, and redemption. A man whose influence stretched so far that some whispered he was less a criminal and more a shadow president of Harlem itself. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but the world knew him as Bumpy Johnson, and his story is not simply one of crime and punishment, but rather an intricate tale of survival, defiance, and the impossible choices faced by a black man in 20th century America who dared to seize power when power was systematically denied to him. When we think of organized crime in America, our minds typically conjure images of Italian dons in expensive suits, of sit-downs in back rooms and bodies dumped in rivers, of the Mafia families that dominated headlines and captured Hollywood's imagination for decades. Yet long before The Godfather became a household name, before Don Vito Corleone became the archetype of the crime boss, there existed in Harlem a parallel universe of power and influence that operated under the radar of mainstream America, run by black men and women who carved out empires in the only spaces that American society had left them: the criminal underworld, the numbers game, the narcotics trade, and the shadowy corridors of Harlem's street economy. And at the very center of this world stood Bumpy Johnson, a man whose network of influence was so extensive, so deeply woven into the fabric of Harlem's daily life, that to understand him is to understand not just the history of organized crime in America, but the hidden history of black resistance, black entrepreneurship, and black power in the 20th century. This is the story of how a man born into poverty in South Carolina, a man who would spend more than a decade in prison before he was even 30 years old, would rise to become arguably the most powerful figure in Harlem, not through legitimate business or inherited wealth, but through cunning, charisma, and an unwillingness to accept the limits that society had placed upon him. This is the story of Bumpy Johnson, and to tell it properly, we must begin not with crime, but with survival. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 16, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, during a time when the promise of emancipation had already begun to curdle into the bitter reality of Jim Crow segregation. His parents, Margaret and William Johnson, were part of the Great Migration's early wave, African Americans who had heard whispers of better opportunities in the North, who believed that leaving the suffocating racism of the South might offer their children a chance at something more. The family moved north when Ellsworth was still young, settling in Harlem, New York, which at that time was beginning its transformation into the beating heart of Black America. Harlem in the early 20th century was not yet the overcrowded ghetto it would later become, but rather a neighborhood in flux, a place where African Americans were beginning to establish themselves despite the constant pressure of segregation and discrimination that boxed them in on all sides. It was a neighborhood filled with possibility and danger in equal measure, where churches and speakeasies sat side by side, where education and enterprise were valued, but where the doors of legitimate opportunity remained largely closed to black residents no matter how talented or determined they might be. Young Ellsworth grew up in this world, and like many boys in Harlem, he learned early that the rules that governed success for white Americans did not apply to him. The legitimate paths to wealth and influence were blocked: the corporate jobs, the professional positions, the business loans that white entrepreneurs could access with ease were simply not available to a young black man, no matter his intelligence or ambition. And so Ellsworth, like thousands of other young men in Harlem, looked elsewhere for opportunity, finding it in the streets, in the numbers game, in the underground economy that flourished in the spaces that mainstream America had abandoned. The numbers game was the lifeblood of Harlem's economy during this period, a sprawling, complex system of illegal gambling that operated openly despite its illegality, that was tolerated by corrupt police who were paid to look the other way, that provided employment for thousands and generated millions of dollars in revenue. In its simplest form, the numbers game worked like this. People would place small bets, usually just pennies or nickels on three-digit numbers, hoping that their number would be drawn that day. The odds were terrible, deliberately stacked in favor of the house, but the payoff was enormous if you won, potentially turning a nickel bet into dollars. For poor people in Harlem, the numbers represented hope, represented the possibility of sudden transformation, of catching a break in a system designed to ensure they never caught one. And the men who ran the numbers game, the bankers, the runners, the numbers kings, became some of the most powerful figures in their communities, controlling vast sums of cash, employing hundreds, wielding influence that extended far beyond the gambling itself into politics, law enforcement, and the very fabric of daily life in Harlem. Young Ellsworth Johnson understood this intuitively. He began his career in the streets as a runner, carrying numbers and money, learning the business from the ground up, absorbing not just the mechanics of the game but the psychology, the economics, the politics that made it all work. He learned about bribery and corruption, about how to manage men, about how to calculate odds and maximize profit, about how to navigate the complicated relationship between the criminal underworld and the legitimate institutions of power that surrounded it. He learned, in essence, how to build and run an empire within an empire, a parallel power structure that existed in the shadows of official Harlem, but was in many ways more powerful, more immediate, and more consequential in people's daily lives than the formal structures of government and law. By the time Ellsworth Johnson reached adulthood, he had already acquired a nickname that would define his entire life: Bumpy, given to him because of the bumps on his head resulting from a childhood illness. The name stuck because it was catchy, because it was memorable, because it embodied something of the streetwise toughness he was developing. Throughout the 1920s, Bumpy Johnson worked his way up through Harlem's criminal hierarchy, establishing himself as a reliable operative, a smart businessman, and a man who could be counted on. He was not flashy, not prone to the kind of unnecessary violence that drew police attention, but rather methodical, efficient, and increasingly profitable. He caught the attention of the major players in Harlem's numbers game, particularly Madame Stephanie St. Clair, one of the most powerful numbers bankers in Harlem during this era, a woman who had built an empire from virtually nothing and who exercised control over millions of dollars in annual numbers business. St. Clair was a visionary in many ways, someone who understood that the numbers game was not just about money, but about power and influence, about the ability to shape political outcomes and social policy in Harlem. She was a mentor to Bumpy Johnson, and under her tutelage, he learned not just how to run the numbers game but how to think about power itself, how to leverage legitimate institutions, how to cultivate relationships with politicians and police officers, how to ensure that his interests were protected not just through force, but through networks of mutual obligation and benefit. But the world that Bumpy Johnson was learning to navigate was about to change dramatically. In 1930, the numbers game in Harlem exploded into open warfare. A new player had arrived on the scene, a man named Dutch Schultz, a white mob boss who controlled much of the gambling and bootlegging operations in the Bronx and other parts of New York. Schultz, with access to the kinds of capital and connections that white criminals could leverage, decided to take over Harlem's numbers game. He began a systematic campaign to push out the independent black numbers bankers like Madame St. Clair, using violence, threats, and the corruption of police and politicians to achieve his goals. This became known as the Numbers War, and it represented a critical moment not just for Bumpy Johnson but for Harlem itself. What was at stake was not just the profitable numbers game, but the very question of whether Black Harlem could maintain control over its own economy, or whether that economy would be colonized by white organized crime, whether the wealth generated in Harlem would stay in Harlem to benefit black residents, or would be extracted by white mobsters for the benefit of people outside the community. Bumpy Johnson, by this point in his career, was in a position to influence how this conflict played out. While he was not yet the top numbers banker in Harlem, he had the respect of the community and the trust of older established players like Madame St. Clair. He worked alongside St. Clair and others to resist Schultz's takeover, engaging in negotiations, trying to forge unity among the various independent black numbers bankers who had the most to lose if Schultz succeeded. The conflict was bitter and violent, involving bombings, assassinations, and street battles that made headlines and terrified Harlem residents. In the end, the black numbers bankers were only partially successful in resisting Schultz's incursion. Some territory was lost, some bankers capitulated, but others, including Bumpy Johnson, managed to maintain control over significant portions of Harlem's numbers game. This experience was crucial in shaping Bumpy Johnson's understanding of power and politics. He learned that resistance was possible, that unity among black business interests could push back against white organized crime, that control over Harlem's economy was something worth fighting for. He also learned the costs of such resistance: the violence, the prison time, the constant pressure from law enforcement. By the 1930s, Bumpy Johnson was increasingly recognized as one of Harlem's leading numbers bankers, a position that brought enormous wealth and influence but also enormous risk. He was arrested multiple times during this period, charged with various crimes related to gambling and racketeering, but the cases were often difficult to prosecute because of the pervasive corruption of the police and court system, and because he was careful never to leave clear evidence of his own involvement in criminal activities. He operated through layers of intermediaries, through carefully constructed chains of command that insulated him from direct criminal liability, while allowing him to exercise control over vast criminal enterprises. This was the art of being a crime boss in 20th century America, not the flashy violence depicted in movies, but the careful management of networks, the cultivation of political relationships, the bribing of officials, and the subtle exercise of coercion through reputation and connections rather than through direct violence. In 1932, however, Bumpy Johnson's rising influence was interrupted by a serious federal charge. He was arrested for drug trafficking, for his involvement in the heroin trade that was beginning to flourish in Harlem during the early Depression years. The charge was serious, and the conviction was serious. Bumpy Johnson was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His sentencing marked the beginning of what would be a long period of incarceration that would dominate the next portion of his life, but would also, paradoxically, enhance his legend and his power. Bumpy Johnson spent the next decade and a half in some of the most notorious federal penitentiaries in America, including Alcatraz, the famous island prison in San Francisco Bay that housed the most dangerous and difficult inmates in the federal system. His years in prison were crucial in shaping the man he would become upon his release. In prison, Bumpy Johnson was not diminished or broken, as the system intended, but rather strengthened, refined, and elevated in status. He was a man of intelligence, dignity, and unflinching courage in an environment where such qualities were rare and deeply valued. He became the leader of the black inmates in several prisons, a man who commanded respect not through brutality but through intelligence and principle. He studied history, read extensively, and developed a political consciousness that extended beyond the street-level pragmatism of his earlier years. He became conscious of himself not just as a criminal entrepreneur, but as a black man resisting white domination, not just in Harlem but in the wider world. He began to develop ideas about black nationalism, about black economic independence, about the possibility of transforming the criminal underworld into a tool for black liberation, rather than just a vehicle for personal enrichment. By the time Bumpy Johnson was released from federal prison in 1955, after serving more than 13 years, he had been transformed into something more than he had been before prison. He was now a legendary figure in Harlem, a man whose legend had grown rather than diminished during his incarceration, a man who was seen not just as a successful criminal, but as someone who had stood up to federal authority and survived, who had refused to be broken by the system. When he walked out of prison, he did not return to Harlem quietly or inconspicuously. Instead, he returned to a hero's welcome, to a community that had kept his memory alive, that had respected his principles and his loyalty, that saw him as a symbol of black resilience and black power. The Harlem that Bumpy Johnson returned to in 1955 was, in many ways, a different place from the Harlem he had left in 1932. The Great Depression had passed, World War II had been fought and won, and black soldiers had returned home with new expectations and new consciousness of their rights and dignity. The civil rights movement was beginning to stir, with Brown versus Board of Education having been decided the year before Bumpy's release, challenging the legal foundations of segregation. The Nation of Islam was growing more powerful, offering black Americans a different vision of what black identity and black power could mean. The music of Harlem had evolved, with bebop and early rhythm and blues beginning to challenge the older jazz styles. The streets were more crowded, more tense, more energized with the possibilities of change. Yet in many ways, the fundamental structure of discrimination and inequality that had dominated Harlem remained the same. Black residents were still trapped in the same overcrowded tenements, still denied access to decent jobs and education, still subject to police brutality and harassment, still excluded from the legitimate pathways to wealth and success that were available to white Americans. The numbers game was still flourishing, still providing employment and income to thousands while generating astronomical profits for the bankers who controlled it. And the vacuum that Bumpy Johnson's imprisonment had created in Harlem's criminal underworld was waiting to be filled. When Bumpy returned to Harlem in 1955, he found a landscape that had changed but not fundamentally transformed. The independent black numbers bankers had been further consolidated, with a few major players controlling most of the action. The white mafia had maintained and even expanded its presence in Harlem, with Italian organized crime figures like Vito Genovese exerting significant control over the drug trade and other criminal enterprises. The police corruption that Bumpy had learned to navigate in the 1930s had only deepened and become more systematized, with entire precincts essentially functioning as tributaries to organized crime. It was into this landscape that Bumpy Johnson stepped upon his release, and his re-entry into Harlem's criminal world was gradual but inexorable. He initially kept a low profile, re-establishing relationships, assessing the new landscape, understanding the shifts that had occurred in his absence. He was 50 years old when he was released, an age at which many men might have sought retirement, but Bumpy Johnson was not most men. He had spent 13 years in prison, years that had done nothing to diminish his hunger for power, his determination to succeed, his refusal to accept the constraints that society sought to impose on him. Within a few years of his release, Bumpy Johnson had re-established himself as a major figure in Harlem's criminal underworld. He was involved in the numbers game, in the drug trade, in loan sharking and protection rackets. But he was also something more. He was becoming a kind of community leader, a man to whom people turned for help and mediation, a figure who wielded a kind of unofficial governmental power in Harlem that many people actually preferred to the official government. To understand how this happened, we need to understand something crucial about the relationship between organized crime and community in places like Harlem during the 1950s and 60s. Official government services in Harlem were minimal, corrupt, and often hostile to the residents. Police harassed black residents constantly, performing stop-and frisks, shaking down small business owners, arresting people on pretexts that would never be applied to white citizens. The city provided minimal social services to Harlem, allowing the neighborhood to deteriorate while extracting taxes from its residents. Schools were underfunded and overcrowded, housing was deteriorating and expensive, legitimate jobs were scarce and low-paying. In the vacuum left by the failure of official institutions, figures like Bumpy Johnson stepped in to provide services, protection, and a kind of justice that the official system was not providing. If a resident needed money for rent or medical care, they could go to the number's banker, who would often provide loans at interest but with a personal relationship, an understanding that official banks would never extend. If someone was assaulted or robbed, they could report it not to the police but to the crime boss, who would track down the perpetrator and exact a punishment that was swift and certain, far more so than the official justice system would provide. If someone had a dispute with a neighbor or a business partner, they could submit it to the crime boss for arbitration, getting a decision that was often more fair and more honored than anything they could expect from the official courts. This is crucial to understanding Bumpy Johnson's power and his appeal. He was not simply a criminal preying on the community, but rather a figure who provided services and security that the official government was failing to provide. He was corrupt, certainly, and he did prey on the poor through the numbers game and through his other criminal enterprises, but he also served as a kind of private government, a shadow state within the legitimate state, providing the basic functions of government: protection, justice, economic opportunity, that the legitimate state was unwilling or unable to provide to Black Harlem. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, Bumpy Johnson's power and influence grew even more pronounced. The civil rights movement was moving north, with Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam becoming increasingly prominent in Harlem. The drug epidemic that was beginning to devastate communities across America was hitting Harlem particularly hard, with heroin use exploding and creating both huge profits for drug dealers and enormous social costs for the community. Police violence and harassment were continuing unabated, with regular incidents of police brutality that inflamed tensions and sparked protests. It was a period of tremendous social change and social stress, and Bumpy Johnson was positioned at the center of multiple intersecting power dynamics. He had developed a complicated relationship with Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. On one level, they represented different approaches to Black power. Malcolm X advocated for the transformation of Black consciousness and Black identity, for religious transformation and moral renovation, while Bumpy Johnson represented the old-school street power, the ability to get things done through connections and leverage in the existing system, regardless of the moral implications. Yet on another level, they shared common enemies and common concerns about white domination and the need for Black self-determination. They shared a neighborhood, and they shared a constituency: the young Black men of Harlem who were searching for alternative models of power and identity in a society that seemed bent on their destruction or marginalization. Rumors swirled about the relationship between Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson, about meetings between them, about the possibility of collaboration or mutual support. Some people claimed that Bumpy Johnson provided protection for Malcolm X, that he had men watching over Malcolm to ensure his safety. Others suggested that the two men had worked together on various schemes, though the evidence for this remains murky and disputed. What seems clear is that each man respected the other, that they understood they were pursuing similar goals through different means, that they occupied overlapping spheres of influence and power in Harlem. As the 1960s progressed, Bumpy Johnson continued to expand his empire. He was involved in drug trafficking, numbers gambling, loan sharking, and various other criminal enterprises. But more importantly, he was accumulating what might be called soft power, the ability to influence events through his reputation, his connections, and the network of obligation and loyalty that he had built over decades. He was known to have police officers, politicians, and judges in his pocket, people who would do favors for him or look the other way when he needed them to. He was known to have the ability to protect people, to make problems go away, to arrange for things to happen that seemed impossible. He was, in short, operating as a kind of shadow government in Harlem, a parallel power structure that often seemed more effective and more responsive to community needs than the official government. The peak of Bumpy Johnson's power and influence came in the early 1960s, when he had consolidated control over much of Harlem's criminal underworld. He had managed to gain significant control over the heroin trade, which was the most lucrative criminal enterprise in Harlem at that time. He had maintained strong relationships with other major crime figures, establishing alliances and understandings that allowed him to dominate major sectors of Harlem's criminal economy. He had cultivated protection in the police department and in city politics, ensuring that his operations could continue with minimal interference. He had built a reputation for honoring his word, for being fair in his dealings, for protecting those who were loyal to him and punishing those who betrayed him. By the early 1960s, Bumpy Johnson was arguably the most powerful figure in Harlem, more powerful in his own way than the official mayor or borough president or police commissioner. His word carried more weight with residents than official pronouncements. His protection was more valuable than official police protection. His justice was more trusted than official justice. He was, in every meaningful sense, a shadow government, a ruler of Harlem operating behind the scenes and often in conflict with the official government, but frequently more effective and more responsive to community needs. The question of whether Bumpy Johnson was a criminal or Harlem's secret government, then, is not really a binary question, but rather a question about the nature of power and legitimacy in communities that have been systematically excluded from access to official power. In a society, and in a city where the official government had failed to provide basic services and protection to black residents, in a neighborhood where police were more likely to brutalize residents than to protect them, in a context where the system of law and order seemed designed to oppress rather than to serve, a man like Bumpy Johnson could become, in the eyes of many residents, not simply a criminal but a figure of legitimate authority, someone to be respected rather than feared, someone whose word was more binding than the law. Yet it is crucial not to romanticize this situation or to treat Bumpy Johnson as a simple hero or freedom fighter. He was involved in the drug trade that was devastating Harlem, that was creating addiction and crime and family destruction throughout the community. He was involved in the numbers game that extracted wealth from poor people who could least afford to lose money, paying out odds that were systematically tilted in his favor. He engaged in various forms of coercion and violence, though he tried to minimize these when possible, preferring manipulation and leverage to direct brutality. He was an entrepreneur of the underground economy, someone who was making an enormous amount of money by preying on the poor and marginalized people of his own community, even if he was also providing services and security that those people found valuable. The contradiction at the heart of Bumpy Johnson's career is precisely that he was doing both things simultaneously, serving the community and preying on it, providing security and promoting the conditions that made security necessary, offering alternative institutions of power while undermining the possibility of legitimate government institutions functioning effectively. This contradiction is not unique to Bumpy Johnson. It is embedded in the nature of organized crime in communities that have been systematically excluded from legitimate economic and political power. When the official system fails to serve the needs of the community, when it seems designed to oppress and exploit rather than to protect and serve, then figures who can operate outside the official system and provide alternative sources of power and provision become enormously attractive, even if they themselves are also exploitative and harmful. By the 1960s, Bumpy Johnson's control over Harlem was being challenged in new ways. First, the heroin epidemic that had been growing throughout the 1950s and early 1960s was beginning to overwhelm Harlem. The drug trade was becoming more violent, with younger and less disciplined dealers beginning to assert themselves, with the amount of money at stake increasing exponentially, with the structure of the drug business becoming more chaotic and less amenable to the kind of centralized control that Bumpy Johnson was trying to maintain. Bumpy Johnson, who had made a great deal of money in the drug trade but who was no longer a young man, was being challenged by younger, more ruthless, and less scrupulous dealers who did not have the same respect for the old rules and old relationships that had governed the Harlem underworld. Second, and perhaps more significantly, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement were beginning to challenge the old structures of power in Harlem in new ways. Malcolm X was becoming an increasingly powerful figure in Harlem, and while Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X may have had a certain mutual understanding, they also represented different visions of Black power and Black liberation. Malcolm X was calling for moral transformation, for a rejection of the old ways, for a new vision of Black identity and Black community that would be based on spiritual regeneration and social discipline, rather than on the old street-based economics and underground entrepreneurship that had characterized Harlem's power structures. The Nation of Islam was attracting thousands of young Black men who might otherwise have been drawn into the street life and the criminal underworld that Bumpy Johnson represented. The growing civil rights movement was bringing a new moral language to Harlem, a language that condemned not just white racism, but also the internal exploitation and corruption that characterized Harlem's underground economy. Third, law enforcement was becoming more aggressive in its targeting of major crime figures like Bumpy Johnson. The federal government had begun to take organized crime more seriously, and while much of this attention was focused on the Italian Mafia, some of it was beginning to be directed toward the major figures in Black organized crime as well. The FBI was developing new investigative techniques, using informants and electronic surveillance in ways that made it increasingly difficult for crime bosses to operate with impunity. The city police were also under pressure to demonstrate results against major crime figures, and while police corruption remained endemic, there was also a new emphasis on high-profile arrests and prosecutions. In this context of change and challenge, Bumpy Johnson's position was becoming more precarious, even as his power continued to seem immense. In 1964, Bumpy Johnson was arrested again, this time for drug trafficking and for conspiracy to distribute narcotics. The charges were serious, the evidence was strong, and Bumpy Johnson was convicted and sentenced to another long stretch in federal prison. He was, at this point, in his late 50s, an age at which a lengthy prison sentence represented a genuine catastrophe, a prospect of spending the remaining years of his life behind bars. His conviction represented a watershed moment in Harlem. The aging criminal patriarch was being removed from power, and the question of who would succeed him and what would become of the power structure he had built was suddenly open. The irony was that Bumpy Johnson's imprisonment came just as the broader social and political currents in Harlem were beginning to shift in directions that might have eventually led him to cede power anyway. The civil rights movement was moving toward more militant forms of Black nationalism and Black power, toward a new generation of leaders who were less interested in the old patronage networks and street-based power, and more interested in grassroots organizing and community transformation. The drug epidemic was becoming a crisis that seemed to demand a different kind of response than the kind of shadow government that Bumpy Johnson had been operating. The question of what crime and organized crime meant in a context of civil rights and Black power was being debated with new intensity and new moral seriousness. Bumpy Johnson's imprisonment, then, was both the culmination of the law's enforcement against him and also a kind of symbolic moment when the old order was passing and a new one was beginning to emerge. Yet even in prison, and even after his release, Bumpy Johnson's legend and his influence continued to grow rather than to diminish. He served his time with dignity and with the same kind of moral authority that he had demonstrated in his earlier prison sentences. He maintained connections and relationships, continued to wield influence, became in many ways an elder statesman of Harlem's underworld, a figure who was respected for having navigated the incredibly difficult terrain of being a major crime figure in 20th century America, and having survived and maintained his dignity and his power, even in the face of serious federal prosecution and imprisonment. When Bumpy Johnson was eventually released from prison in the late 1960s, he was a man approaching 70 years old, and he had lost the vigor and the directness that had characterized his earlier years. But his legend was larger than ever, and he was in some ways more influential than he had been before his final imprisonment. He became a kind of counselor to younger crime figures, a symbol of the old order that was passing, a reminder of a time when Harlem had had a kind of unified structure of power that seemed, in retrospect, almost admirable compared to the chaos and violence that was increasingly characterizing the drug trade in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Bumpy Johnson's later years, from the late 1960s until his death in 1972, were marked by a certain ambiguity. He was no longer the active crime boss that he had been in his prime, no longer directly running criminal enterprises, but rather operating as an elder figure, a counselor, a living embodiment of Harlem's criminal past. He had become, in some ways, a symbol of black resistance and black power, even though his methods and his goals were quite different from those of the civil rights activists and black power advocates who were the more celebrated figures of the era. He was also, increasingly, a figure of nostalgia, someone who embodied an earlier era of Harlem when crime was organized and controlled, and when the underworld had something like its own system of justice and order. By the early 1970s, Harlem had entered into a new and more chaotic phase. The civil rights era was waning, the Black Power movement was fragmenting, the heroin epidemic was spiraling completely out of control, and the old structures of organized crime that had been maintained through the 1960s were collapsing under the weight of younger dealers, turf wars, and increased law enforcement activity. The shadow government that Bumpy Johnson had built was no longer functioning. The old system of patronage and protection was breaking down. The sense of order and predictability that had characterized Harlem's underworld in earlier decades was giving way to chaos and violence. In this context, figures like Bumpy Johnson, who had maintained the old order and had derived their power from the maintenance of that order, were becoming anachronistic. Bumpy Johnson died of natural causes in 1972, at the age of 66, having lived a life that spanned the entire history of Harlem as the capital of Black America. His death marked the end of an era, the era of the individual crime boss who could exercise personal power and influence over a neighborhood, who could maintain relationships with police and politicians, who could serve as a kind of shadow government. The age of Bumpy Johnson was passing, replaced by the age of drug cartels and organized syndicates that were larger, more violent, and less connected to the neighborhoods that they preyed upon. In death, Bumpy Johnson's legend only grew. He became a symbol of a kind of Harlem that was being lost, a place where there had been order and hierarchy, where there had been a code of honor among thieves, where there had been individuals who exercised power and influence and took responsibility for their actions and their effects on their communities. The nostalgia for this era, for a time when crime seemed more organized and more honorable, says something profound about the nature of the age that came after, an age characterized by greater chaos, greater violence, and a kind of atomization of the criminal underworld that made it seem less like a shadow government and more like a plague of locusts, simply consuming and destroying whatever it encountered. The question of whether Bumpy Johnson was a criminal or Harlem's secret government, then, is a question that can only be answered by understanding the specific historical context in which he operated, and the particular way that black communities in 20th century America were excluded from access to legitimate power and legitimate economic opportunity. In a city and a society where official institutions were failing black people, where police were more likely to brutalize than to protect, where legitimate businesses would not hire black workers, where the political system was indifferent to black needs and concerns, Bumpy Johnson stepped into a vacuum and built institutions and power structures that provided security, justice, and economic opportunity that the legitimate system was not providing. The fact that he did this for profit, that he exploited people even as he was serving them, that his shadow government extracted enormous wealth from the poor and marginalized community that it simultaneously protected, does not make him a simple villain or a simple hero, but rather a complex historical figure who embodied the contradictions of his time and place. To understand Bumpy Johnson is to understand something crucial about the history of Black America in the 20th century. The history of how Black communities were forced to create parallel institutions and parallel power structures. How Black entrepreneurship and Black capitalism often had to take the form of criminal enterprise because legitimate enterprise was barred to them. How the very structures of discrimination and oppression that were imposed upon Black people created the conditions for figures like Bumpy Johnson to rise to power and influence. It is also to understand how these parallel power structures, while providing real services and real security to their communities, also trapped those communities in cycles of crime and addiction and violence. How the shadow government of Bumpy Johnson, while more responsive in some ways to community needs than the official government, was also fundamentally exploitative and ultimately destructive. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson is therefore mixed and complex. On one hand, he represents a kind of Black resistance and Black self-determination, the refusal to accept the constraints that white society sought to impose, the determination to seize power and build institutions even when official channels were closed to him. On the other hand, he represents the tragic necessity of that resistance taking criminal form, the tragic reality that Black economic power had to be built through narcotics and gambling, and the exploitation of the poor because legitimate paths to economic power were barred. He represents both the ingenuity and the tragedy of the Black experience in 20th century America, the ingenuity of Black people in creating structures of power and community, even in the most constrained circumstances, the tragedy that such ingenuity had so often to find expression in criminal activity because legitimate paths were blocked. In his later years, Bumpy Johnson became something of a folk hero in Harlem, a figure who was celebrated in stories and songs and films, who was remembered as someone who had stood up to white domination, who had maintained Black control over Harlem's economy even in the face of pressure from the Italian Mafia and the federal government. But this celebration and romanticization can obscure the more difficult historical truth that Bumpy Johnson's rise to power was made possible by the systematic failure of legitimate institutions to serve Black people, that his shadow government, while providing real security and real services, was also fundamentally extractive and exploitative, that the question of crime and criminality in Black communities cannot be separated from the question of racism and discrimination that created the conditions for crime to flourish. The true crime, in other words, was not simply what Bumpy Johnson did, but the system of segregation and discrimination that made a figure like Bumpy Johnson necessary and possible, that created the conditions in which crime became not simply a deviation from the legitimate order, but rather an alternative order, one that in many ways seemed more just and more effective than the legitimate order itself. To understand Bumpy Johnson, then, is to see him not simply as a criminal or as Harlem's secret government, but as both simultaneously, as a figure who was forced by historical circumstances and social exclusion to create the kind of power and institutions that Black people could not access through legitimate means. His story is the story of Harlem, the story of Black America in the 20th century, the story of the complex and tragic ways that racial discrimination shaped not just the lives of individuals, but the entire structure of urban life in America. When we examine Bumpy Johnson's life in retrospect, we must grapple with the reality that he was not an aberration, but rather a natural product of the system that sought to control and limit Black life in America. He was not a criminal who happened to be Black, but rather a Black man who was forced into criminality by a system that offered him no legitimate alternatives, no legitimate paths to power, no legitimate ways to accumulate wealth and influence. The very fact that he became so successful, so powerful, and so respected suggests something profound about the failure of official institutions and the success of his alternative institutions in meeting community needs. The numbers game that Bumpy Johnson was involved in provided employment to thousands and provided hope and entertainment to tens of thousands more. The loan sharking operations that he engaged in provided capital to people and small businesses that banks would not loan to. The protection rackets that he maintained provided security that police would not provide. The drug trade that he was involved in, while destructive and harmful, was also enormously profitable and provided opportunities for thousands of young black men who could not find employment in the legitimate economy. None of this is to say that these activities were good or beneficial. Clearly, the numbers game was extractive, the loan sharking was exploitative at high interest rates, the protection rackets were coercive, and the drug trade was enormously destructive. But it is to say that these activities filled real needs in a community that was being systematically neglected by official institutions, and that understanding Bumpy Johnson requires understanding both his harmful effects and his service functions simultaneously. As we look back on Bumpy Johnson's life from the vantage point of the 21st century, we see a man who operated in a very different world from our own, a world where race relations were more explicitly hierarchical, where segregation was legal and enforced, where black people were more completely excluded from legitimate economic and political power than they are today. And yet, we also see patterns and structures that continue to resonate in contemporary America. The mass incarceration of black men, the overpolicing of black communities, the persistent exclusion of black people from access to legitimate capital and business opportunities, the ways that drug trafficking continues to be a major source of income and power in marginalized communities. All of these patterns that were present in Bumpy Johnson's time continue into our own. The question of the relationship between crime and community, between the underground economy and legitimate institutions, between the shadow government of street-based power and the official government, remains relevant to understanding contemporary American cities. In this sense, Bumpy Johnson's story is not simply a historical curiosity or a tale from a past era, but rather a lens through which we can examine contemporary realities and understand the deep structural causes of crime and violence in marginalized communities. The temptation in telling Bumpy Johnson's story is to either romanticize him as a kind of folk hero and Robin Hood figure, or to condemn him as a simple villain and criminal who preyed on his own community. The more accurate and more complex historical truth is that Bumpy Johnson was neither and both simultaneously. He was a man of intelligence, courage, and principle who managed to navigate an extraordinarily difficult terrain and build power and influence despite tremendous obstacles. He was also a man who exploited his community, who profited from human addiction and desperation, who engaged in violence and coercion as a means to accumulate wealth and power. He was a product of his time and his circumstances, someone whose trajectory was shaped by forces far larger than himself, by the system of segregation and discrimination that confined black people to Harlem, by the failure of legitimate institutions to serve black people, by the structures of organized crime that offered one of the few paths to power available to black men in 20th century America. Understanding Bumpy Johnson means understanding all of these dimensions of his life simultaneously, refusing to reduce him to a simple moral category, recognizing the ways that individual agency and structural constraint, personal ambition and historical circumstance interacted to produce the life and the power that he achieved. It means understanding that in a just society, there would be no Bumpy Johnsons, that the fact of his rise to power is itself an indictment of the system that created the conditions for his rise. It means recognizing that the question of whether he was a criminal or Harlem's secret government is itself a false dichotomy, that he was operating in a space created by the failure of official government, that the real question we should be asking is not about Bumpy Johnson's morality or criminality, but about the failure of American institutions to serve the people whom they claim to govern. In the final analysis, Bumpy Johnson's story is a story about power, about who has it, how it is exercised, what it means, and what happens when official power fails to serve the needs of the people. It is a story about how power can be created and accumulated outside of official channels when official channels are closed. It is a story about the ways that power created outside of official channels is both more responsive to community needs in some ways and more exploitative in others. It is a story about the complex relationship between crime and community, between the shadow state and the official state, between the possibilities and the limitations of resistance within and against systems of domination. And most fundamentally, it is a story about race in America, about what it has meant to be black in a system designed to subordinate and control black people, about how black people have created institutions, accumulated power, and maintained dignity in the face of that system, even when the forms that their resistance and their power building have had to take have been destructive and harmful to themselves and to their own communities. The life of Bumpy Johnson reminds us that the history of crime in America is inseparable from the history of race, that organized crime in black communities has very different causes and very different meanings than organized crime in white communities or organized crime run by white people. That understanding crime requires understanding the larger context of inequality and exclusion in which crime flourishes. It reminds us that the distinction between criminal and law-abiding citizen is not always clear-cut or morally absolute, that the law itself can be an instrument of oppression, and that violation of unjust laws can sometimes be a form of resistance or of meeting community needs that the law and the official system are failing to meet. It reminds us that communities create their own institutions and their own systems of order and justice when official institutions fail them, and that these alternative institutions, while providing real services and real security, are also limited and destructive in their own ways. And it reminds us that real social change requires not just individual acts of resistance or rebellion, but fundamental transformation of the institutions and systems that create the conditions for crime and criminality in the first place. Bumpy Johnson's story is ultimately a tragedy not of individual failure but of systemic failure, a tragedy in which an intelligent and capable man is forced to build his power and his influence through criminal enterprise because legitimate avenues are closed to him. A tragedy in which a man who might have been a great legitimate businessman or political leader or community organizer instead becomes a crime boss because that is the only path to power available to him. It is a tragedy also in the sense that the shadow government that Bumpy Johnson created, while providing real services and real security, also trapped Harlem in cycles of addiction and crime and violence, that his success in building an alternative power structure inadvertently made it more difficult for legitimate institutions to develop and function, that his solution to the problem of exclusion from legitimate power ultimately perpetuated that exclusion by making the community more dependent on the underground economy and less able to develop legitimate institutional capacity. The real solution to the Bumpy Johnson problem, in other words, is not to celebrate or condemn individual crime bosses, but to transform the conditions that make crime bosses necessary and possible, to ensure that legitimate institutions actually serve the needs of all people, that legitimate paths to power and wealth and influence are available to all people regardless of race, that communities are not forced to create shadow governments because official governments are failing them. This is the lesson that Bumpy Johnson's life teaches us, not that we should admire or emulate him, but that we should work to create conditions in which figures like Bumpy Johnson are no longer necessary, in which communities are served by institutions that actually have their interests at heart, in which power is distributed more equitably and more justly, in which black people and all marginalized people have legitimate access to the power and the resources and the opportunities that are currently available only to the privileged few. Bumpy Johnson died in 1972, but his legacy continues to resonate in contemporary America. He is remembered in Harlem, in songs and stories and films, as a man who stood up to white domination, who built power in a community where power was denied, who exercised a kind of justice when official justice was unavailable. But he is also remembered as a symbol of an era when organized crime seemed to have an internal logic and an internal morality, when crime bosses were figures of respect rather than figures of derision, when the underground economy seemed more organized and more stable than it would become in the decades after his death. The chaos and fragmentation of the drug trade in subsequent decades, the epidemic of violence that characterized the crack cocaine era of the 1980s and 90s, the dissolution of the old structures of organized crime and their replacement by more violent and more chaotic forms of criminal enterprise. All of this has led to a certain nostalgia for the era of Bumpy Johnson, a sense that at least in his time, there was order and hierarchy and a kind of code of honor, even if that order and that code were built on the exploitation and the suffering of the poor. This nostalgia is understandable but also dangerous, because it romanticizes the very system of organized crime that was responsible for so much harm to Harlem and to Black America. It is important to remember that Bumpy Johnson, for all of his accomplishments and his power and his influence, was ultimately part of a system of exploitation, that his success was built on the misery and the addiction and the desperation of the people of Harlem, that the order and the hierarchy that he maintained came at an enormous cost to the community that he supposedly served. At the same time, it is important to recognize that the alternative to Bumpy Johnson's ordered crime was not the restoration of legitimate government and legitimate economic opportunity for Harlem, but rather the chaos and violence of the subsequent decades, the fragmentation of organized crime into countless small-time dealers and hustlers, the penetration of the drug trade into every corner of the community, the development of a culture of violence and atomization that seemed even more destructive than the older system had been. The real question that Bumpy Johnson's life raises is not whether we should celebrate or condemn him, but how we can build legitimate institutions and legitimate paths to power and prosperity that are truly available to all people, that do not require people to turn to crime in order to survive and to provide for their families, that actually serve the needs and the interests of marginalized communities. This is the challenge that remains unmet in contemporary America, the challenge that Bumpy Johnson's life and death illuminates so clearly. In conclusion, Bumpy Johnson was not simply a criminal and not simply Harlem's secret government, but rather a man who operated in the space created by the failure of official government, who built institutions and exercised power in ways that were both responsive to community needs and exploitative of community vulnerability. He was a product of his time and his circumstances, someone whose remarkable abilities and ambitions were channeled into criminal enterprise because legitimate avenues for the exercise of those abilities and ambitions were closed to him because of his race. He was both a beneficiary and a victim of the system of segregation and discrimination that confined him and his community to Harlem. He was a man of intelligence and principle who also engaged in exploitation and harm. He built something real and valuable in his community, even as that something he built was ultimately limited and ultimately destructive. To understand Bumpy Johnson is to understand something essential about the history of race and crime and power in 20th century America, to see how systems of oppression and exclusion create the conditions for the rise of alternative power structures. To recognize that the real problem is not individual criminals, but the systems that produce them, and to understand that real liberation and real justice require not just resistance to existing systems, but the creation of new systems that truly serve the needs and the interests and the dignity of all people. Bumpy Johnson's life is a cautionary tale and an inspiring tale, a tale of human agency and human limitation, a tale that shows us both what is possible and what is wrong with a society that forces its most talented and ambitious people to pursue their dreams through criminal enterprise, that channels human ingenuity and human courage toward destruction rather than toward creation. It is a tale that haunts us and challenges us to do better, to build better institutions, to create conditions in which the next Bumpy Johnson never has to choose between poverty and crime, in which legitimate paths to power and prosperity are truly available to all.